Hello, welcome everyone to the TopCyberPro podcast. I'm Jim West, the founder and CEO of TopCyberPro.com, where our mission is to close the skills gap. And today we have a wonderful guest today, Mr. Stiepan Kovac, who I actually met just a few months earlier this year at the Doden APL Day, where we both were presenting at the conference. And he had a great topic, and his business is involved in some great emerging frontline technology. He's working around quantum computing, particularly quantum resistant computing. And we're going to talk a lot of terms about quantum computing that you might not be familiar with. So we're going to have Stiepan try to explain the different layers and components that make up what this technology and these services are going to do for our businesses. It's going to be a significant disruptor, because if people think today that everything we're hearing about today is about AI, that is not the real disruptor. I mean, it is a disruptor when it comes to data and scraping, and there's a lot of things around AI. But the real next big disruptor is quantum computing, and it's going to be here sooner than we expect. And it's going to be businesses like Stiepan's company who is trying to lead and guide the proper way to go about treating cryptography in a quantum computing era. So without further ado, I'm going to turn over to Stiepan to introduce himself, talk about his business, what got him into cyber, and what his business is trying to do for not just for commercial businesses in the industry, for defense, for everyone, because quantum computing and quantum resistant cryptography is going to be extremely important in our near future. So without further ado, Stiepan.
Thank you, Jim. So indeed, that's a great opportunity, and I'm glad we met in Maryland at the hotel, which is where we have our offices as well, just to the back of the building. So basically, you almost visited our offices without visiting them. We are quantum resistant cryptography. So as the name implies, it's cryptography designed to withstand both today's attacks, including machine learning, AI-enabled attacks, as well as attacks on the horizon, such as quantum-based attacks, and as will emerge, quantum machine learning attacks as well, as that's where things get really interesting / scary, depending on your point of view and the model. So we are a company that's present both in Switzerland, in the European Union, Luxembourg concretely, and US. With headquarters in Ireland, some presence as well, rather north of the East Coast, representative as well as West Coast. We focus on making cryptography as secure as it gets and usable now, including a safety critical scenario, which, as you mentioned, includes defense, preference, also automotive. We set a few standards for cryptography in 5G, and in particular the automotive vertical, setting one and only good practice for quantum safe 5G in the ITUT. Reference X1811 8551 for those who would like to research it. And we participate very actively in the current efforts to standardize quantum resistant cryptography, which is often called post-quantum cryptography, and I'll explain a bit later why we believe that's a misnomer. And that's mainly done today at the ISO level, speaking of international standards, including the US. And there is also some efforts that are Europe-specific happening in some of the European standardization institutions, where there is also quite some interesting things, notably as it relates to enabling of very strict data protection laws through cryptography. Something that we already did in a German standard a few years back, has the only Swiss company to be invited to a German standard. And while those are, how to say, neighboring countries, it's not necessarily evident, especially that Switzerland is not part of the EU, etc., etc. I won't enter into the politics of it, but it was really because we were bringing something unique to the table. We right now are at a juncture point in this standardization process. I'm speaking here back to the international level, the ISO level, which the US NSA, together with NIST, clearly said they would look to the ISO, the international standards, in order to adopt the final version of their own draft standards that they already, meanwhile, published, but again, as draft. And so there is a huge responsibility that falls on us international standardizers I'm one of the 6 editors that deals with this matter of post-quantum key exchange mechanisms, as they're called, key encapsulation mechanisms, to be very exact, and even less clear with the terminology, unfortunately. And so this is something where there are basically two tendencies that are fighting each other. One is doing as we always did, we being the loosely defined cryptographic community, and meaning continuing, even though we are speaking of quantum resistant slash post-quantum cryptography, so something that's supposed to be safe against quantum computing, that's a billion of times more efficient at cracking existing mechanisms than normal supercomputers, including very large ones. Um, there is a tendency to simply keep doing what was done so far as it relates to the selection of parameters and so on and so forth. Obviously, that's one tendency. The other one being to be much more conservative in the security sense of the term, and meaning you will rather go for the more secure parameters and have therefore more margin to resist not only what we anticipate immediately as quantum attacks, but also those that are emerging, including the combination of quantum machine learning and so on and so forth. And as a result of that, we do have sometimes quite heated exchanges among standardizers, with essentially the goal being obviously to have the best possible security, at least for those obviously that are pushing for that, which is non-trivial. As You would be actually surprised that in that context, and I have to precise, we are there representing our EU company, so we are Luxembourg in that context. But that being said, despite being EU company, which while it is a US ally, it's not the US. We are the ones with what we consider, and we also verified this with several of our contacts in the national security space, etc., that actually most closely represent what should or could be a US position with a correct, let's say, focus on making mechanisms actually secure, versus the other position which I will loosely describe as the Chinese one. It's not a very exact term, but essentially, and to make it very short, the first things that we saw in the 90s with, at the time it was the UK, were very active at making the GSM related ciphers not so secure so that they could hack into it. But that's in the 90s. That's a very long time ago. We are in 2024. And what occurred meanwhile, China has diligently copied all those processes, basically all the bad stuff that we had in the West, they have copied it. And so now they are at the forefront of trying, and to a certain extent, actually diminishing the security of international standards, especially as it relates to data protection, being that this is not coherent with their law on cryptography. They have a law on cryptography that clearly distinguishes commercial cryptography, which in their definition of it means something that the state, that is the Chinese state, can easily crack, and non-commercial cryptography, that is the one used by the state and that is supposed to be more secure, which is very nice in their model. Let's put it that way, to be polite, but not necessarily what the whole world would need or want to go towards. And unfortunately, it is very much what so far, even though not at the level that China would have wanted, the direction where global standards in general, so those that are most generic, such as what I was referring to in ISO, are going, for the reason that, well, that's oversimplification, but first of all, one of the reasons, one aspect of this is that it's consensus based. And so when you do have some elements that push very strongly in one direction, obviously you will never get the consensus to go fully in the other direction. So that's both a blessing and a curse, because indeed it does mean that we rather are speaking of the choices, for instance, for the security levels, somewhere where the UK would tend to be nowadays, which is somewhere in between. It's not as secure as, for instance, what the NSA recommends in CNSA 2, but it's still more secure in general, with some exceptions, than what China is pushing for. And so that tends to be, roughly speaking, where the international consensus is going towards. But there is another layer to that that is much less understood, and is related to the following. Unfortunately, that same nation state has been very successful at placing elements that are favorable to their goals at the relevant places where it can actually have an influence on the outcome of such processes. And very concretely, if we speak, and by the way, why am I a standardizer at the moment for Luxembourg and not for the US, despite the US being our main market? If you look at the board of Insights, which is the overarching body that deals with standardization, especially in our domain in the US, where obviously US institutions such as NIST, the NSA, etc., participate, but also you have companies. So if you look at their board, as key member of their board, and with the special rights that this gives them, you have, well, not Huawei, because that would be too big, and for now they are forbidden in the US. I say for now because I sense some weakness lately in the DoD space that does not bode well, in my view, to that regard. But it's FutureWay. What is FutureWay? FutureWay is no other than the daughter company of Huawei in California. So as anyone that knows anything about Chinese companies, where the state has the total, not to say totalitarian power on all of its citizens and companies, it's the same. The fact that it's registered in California has absolutely no influence on the decisions that are taken there. Everything is decided by the Chinese Communist Party. And so you have them right in the middle. It's the fox in the middle of the hen house. And it's a very serious problem. I believe that the US should become cognizant of it, especially that now NATO realized that China is a threat. It's not just a competitor, it's an actual threat. So this is public information, and has been in the headlines as of very late,
So
two,
before,
3 days ago.
yeah.
Just one thing. It would be wise if those in charge at a higher level in the US of those mechanisms, such as the Department of Commerce, would intervene there and basically be an arbiter of not truth, but let's say what is in the US best interest. And I was very long, so please go ahead.
No, no. So there's a lot of pieces I want to kind of address, and because, like I said, you
Yes,
provided a lot of information. So I want to kind of
yes,
start with the basics, right? So, when we're talking
yes,
cryptography, and it's for a lot of folks that are brand new to this. So if there's professionals on this watching this podcast, I'm going to apologize because I do need to do some explain like I'm five here. So in cryptography, you have the essence of where we have an algorithm that's going to perform some a very complex mathematical equation that's going to result in usually a pair of numbers, okay? And these numbers are referred to as like keys. And so in
yes,
any kind of cryptographic algorithm, you have what's kind of called a key space. So if you kind of imagine a circle, a pool, if you will, of all these possibilities, right? These are your keys. And so when you talk about cracking an encryption standard or an algorithm or breaking the code. It's basically referring to guessing what that key could be with a certain degree of probability for the attacker. So the probability usually comes down to what generally in the cryptography industry is referred to as a coin flip. If you can get to as close to 50% of guessing the key in that key space, then you have effectively defeated. That's the general standard. I know there's other people in the industry that have different measures, and we won't go into that rabbit hole. But generally speaking, it's accepted in industry. If half the key space can be brute forced by any system, that crypto system is no longer valid, at least for defense purposes. Things such as secret, classified, top secret is no longer valid if that can be defeated. So the challenge that the cryptographic industry and governments and everybody in the world is facing is that when they want to keep their data hidden and restricted from view because networks transfer large amounts of data every day, we have to have these encryption standards. So what you've seen with NIST doing these several rounds in the news about rounds of different mathematician groups trying to come up with these new algorithms that, like Kyber, we have there's about 4 or 5 that have been deemed quantum resistant. And the key thing that you need to pay attention to is the language is everything, especially when it comes to laws, ISO standards, and legality. The word resistant in science, anything in science, you have things that have still yet to be proven. Because we don't have what's deemed, or in the industry, there's no measure yet of what a quantum supercomputer will be. But we do know that every day there's new companies and businesses lining up those qubits, which are the functional processing blocks of a quantum computer, and they're adding more and more qubits. But at some point, the industry as a whole will have to say, this many qubits is equivalent to the baseline of a supercomputer, and we will enter a new industry of what I refer to as quantum supremacy. And once we reach that point with quantum supremacy, that quantum supercomputer will be potentially able to break or defeat half the key space in what's called a reasonable amount of time. Because when you think of brute force, it's like attacking. With a classical computer, it does it kind of sequentially, 1, 1, 1. Now, of course, it's doing it rapidly, and I can't represent it visually. But a traditional computer does 1 and 0, 1 and 0. With a quantum computer, it has another state. It has superposition, it has entanglement. There's another mode, but the most two common is entanglement and superposition. The key for defeating quantum computers will have on their side is superposition. They could be 1, 0, and both at the same time. And so it's a real hard concept in quantum physics to explain, but the easiest way that I was explaining superposition is that the lights in my room right now are both on and off. And try to wrap your head around that. It's really hard, but that's really, the lights are on and off at the same time.
Can I try to make it more for a 5 years old?
Yes,
I happen to have a son roughly of that age. So what I would start saying is that there is a very nasty king, and this very nasty king is trying to either steal our keys or somehow, because nowadays everything is digital, guess those keys. As nowadays, because everything is digital, guessing those keys is enough and has the same material effect as physically stealing them and getting the entry into the doors of our treasures, our defense secrets, whatever that might be. And by the way, I'm a proponent of having a minimum strong baseline, whether it's for private data or for classified data, because at the end of the day, we are as secure as the family members of our generals. So if they all use TikTok and whatnot, we are not secure. That's it. Speaking specifically of the quantum question, and to continue on my analogy, that very nasty king, he would like actually that he does not even need a quantum computer to break encryption, that he can use, for instance, the heaps of Bitcoin mining hardware that he has confiscated from his citizens a few years back and repurpose this to crack all of our passwords, keys, etc. And by weakening the encryption standards, not only the existing ones, but the one of the future, that's precisely the goal that could be attained. And so I believe it could be a good thing if I very briefly display the presentation
Okay.
that you saw when we met, because
Yes.
that will illustrate a little bit better what I'm talking about. Just
Yes.
give me a second that I load it. Obviously, that will be more for a 15 than a 5 years old, but I hope you will pardon me.
No
Uh,
worries.
so, open. Yeah.
So while Stefan's opening up this presentation to share with us, just to kind of add some more, there's a lot that he had information he had given. He talked about things such as paying attention to how keys are encapsulated with key exchange. And so this is important because anytime you're sending a potential key through a system, you have to make sure it's also protected. So you have to think in terms of how is it transported and how is it wrapped, because there's risk that in a moment in time that key can be intercepted in transit. So you have to think in terms of how the encapsulation is done. So the procedure of even sending and rekeying becomes very, very important. How you do key management becomes crucial because, again, you have your own crypto library, if you will, or that pool of possibilities that you have for your algorithm standard, and then you have to protect that. And so as you generate keys, as you start establishing connections based upon these numbers, these keys, it becomes important to protect them at all costs. And if those measures or those systems that are generating or protecting those keys are not up to the higher standards of which you're using the keys for, then you undermine the whole. It's a house of cards then if you're using weaker systems out in
I
crypto.
agree.
Yeah.
And I found out the screen was shared, but since we put the whiteboard down, we don't see it. So can you please click the whiteboard
Yes.
icon also on your side so you will see it?
Okay, here we go.
I'm sorry about that.
Ah, there we go. I can
I
see
thought,
it.
yeah, I thought it was my phone overheating, so I took it out of the
Oh,
cover,
no
because it's
worries.
very hot.
So I see it here.
Yes. So now here, well, I'll skip the intro. That's me. Now here we speak of something already a bit more concrete. We want to be resistant for quantum, obviously, but as well any other threat on cryptography. And with that, we can have, in a defense context, that was the context of my presentation, Dodin, timely delivery of important data, and obviously secure delivery at the same time. As our chairman, our group chairman, who is a long-time DARPA, etc., advisor, would say the only time is now, and he's a quantum physicist, so that has a deep meaning in terms of quantum physics. There is no such thing as time in the absolute. It's the way we perceive things, if you wish. And yet, in the reality we do perceive, the speed of the data delivery is one of the most critical importance alongside with its security. And the same goes for the financial world, of course. And so that's why we want to have something that's very fast, but also cost effective. So mainly software-based solutions whenever possible. It
Of course.
happens to be
Well, not to
something
interrupt,
that we
the
have.
more you
Yes,
incorporate complexity or hardware or more processes to do a function, when you add complexity, you drive down people's adoption of it. So when you're dealing with defense
exactly.
or like you said, finance, where people need it, they need it now. They don't need to wait. You have to find the right
Yes,
balance
yes,
of
yes.
security and usability. So yes, continue.
100%. And the last point here is the comparison to the first space race, which at the time was between the US and the Soviet Union. And at the time, NASA had deployed and, first of all, developed for several millions, it would be tens, if not 100 million today, in today's dollars, a pen that can write in space, which is quite an achievement because it did not leak ink all across the capsule, even though the astronauts were in different gravity conditions than on Earth. But what did the other side do at the time? And for this, they were the wiser ones, is they use a pencil. So a pencil, because of the way it's made, it just works on paper, whether it's on the moon or on Earth.
It's just
So
exchange of
that,
graphite. Yes.
yes, exactly. And so, well, it might leak some graphite in the space
But
cabin, but
very
it
minimal
seems that it
risk.
had, yeah, it was a tolerable risk.
Yes.
And here we are facing a very similar situation, but the tables have been turned. Nowadays, we always hear of debt, etc. Well, we have a situation where our biggest adversaries, they actually have, at least for the things that matter to them, most budget. And we have more and more reductions of budget for things that do matter. So we have to be the clever ones. And it occurs that using software and concretely quantum resistant cryptography, as opposed to what they are doing, which is quantum cryptography or quantum key distribution is another name for it, and it's very expensive because you need special hardware. They do it with satellites. So imagine being able to transmit securely some data without any cable, using some lasers, and having the assurance that if someone intercepts it, you would catch him and whatnot. This is extremely complex. It is theoretically secure, but only up to a certain bound. And actually, and well, thanks God, since there are adversaries, it is not really secure in practice, and it can be intercepted at the nano level, again, quantum physics. And so here the NSA has been very wise in saying in 2022 already, the way to go to face the quantum threat is quantum resistant cryptography. Now, of course, the whole battle and the, how to say, the devil is in the detail is how do you define exactly and how do you standardize that quantum resistant cryptography so that it actually does what it is supposed to do. And so if I go to the next slide, we have the discussion, first of all, of security levels. As mentioned, already in 2022, they have recommended that quantum resistant, so the NSA has recommended quantum resistant cryptography as the way to go against the quantum threat. And furthermore, towards the end of 2022, in the fall, if I remember correctly, they published CNSA2, which is a set of recommendations as to the algorithms, at least tentatively, and more importantly, because that's already definitive, the security levels that need to be used at minimum to protect classified information. And it's any classified information, or as I like to say, any private information, basically, because there is no material reason why it would not be the case. It's not only top secret stuff. So the very minimum level of classification, you need to have what they describe in CNSA2. That's a very important aspect because it used to be that what is the minimum in there was the maximum for top secret stuff. And that brings me back to my discussion without the slides before of whether we still follow the mentality of pre-CNSA2 and pre-quantum and apply it now to the standards that are to implement this in practice, which would be a fallacy, but unfortunately is to a large extent what is happening because of the way international standardization works. Or do we actually stick to the mandate and have the minimum level as the minimum level that is described here? That's a really 10,000 feet view without diving into the specifics of the algorithms. And also having in mind that AES 256, as it stands, which is the minimum security level for symmetric cryptography in CNSA2, is already broken if you look at it from the perspective of side channel attacks. So you have to add several layers of protection and whatnot so that it would not be feasible to attack it using a side channel attack. For instance, what we are using in our phones, like for instance, here I have my second phone, there is inside the SIM card, and inside that SIM card, there is some root key. When one authenticates on the network, it uses an algorithm called mileage, typically, at least for 4G. And mileage in the backend uses AES. And immaterial of the key size, in this case it's rather 1 to 8, but that does not have any influence. It can be extracted. That root key can be extracted just by having a laptop sufficiently close with an antenna and listening to the EM traces of this mileage algorithm being used. So that's a major vulnerability in the existing AES, again, independently of the key size, and it's publicly known, at least since 2015. In Black Hat, Professor Yu in Las Vegas made that demonstration how you can very easily steal the root key from a SIM card. So even for the very minimum here that we define in CNSA2 and that is being debated internationally that we should go even under that, that's not really as secure as it should be. So let alone what's under that. And hence, first of all, a takeaway for this, and then I come to the details in the next slide, giving a second life to AES because of its distribution, because it's used everywhere, and it had the benefit to
It's
society
it
of
is
more
the
than
most
250 billion
it is the
already in
most used
2018.
encryption
Yes,
standard in the world.
yes.
It is the
We
most
need
used.
to fix it. We cannot just throw it to the trash. We need to
So
enhance it. And the good news is that it is feasible. That's precisely one of the key things that we are doing.
yes. Well, one of the things I have a presentation that I've given on the real threat of quantum computing, and there was some math I did. And so back when I first generated these slides, 5+ years ago about the threat of quantum computing, there was some math done. And at that time, there's a top 500 list, which is anyone can Google it, which is the top 500 supercomputers on the planet. And of course,
Mhm.
there's a couple of countries you're going to see in that top 10, and usually it's US and China. Every now and then you'll get a French or Swiss or Japan will put out a supercomputer, but the prevalence of US and China kind of, you see a
Yeah.
battle happening
So,
on that top 500 list. But when I did the
yes.
math years ago, the Tiani 2 had just dropped from number one on that list. And the Tiani 2
Mhm.
supercomputer, when I did the math back then, the math showed
Mhm.
that it would take, to defeat 256 by brute force, it would take 10 to the 38 power, exponent power, of Tiani 2A supercomputers to defeat to go through half the key space by brute force, which there is not enough materials on the planet or enough
Mhm.
time of the entirety of the universe to try to defeat AS256. And again, that's
Mhm.
based on the Tiani 2 from several years ago, which was, it's still in the top 15, I believe, on the list. But that was a
Yes.
supercomputer, a traditional supercomputer
Yes.
built upon traditional supercomputer or CPU standards that we have. And so the issue now becomes,
Um,
we won't know until there's a quantum supercomputer standard of what it can do, how much compute and processing that it can potentially do with superposition that can be applied against that pool, if you will, of probability. So there's another term that, and I know Stefan will have some more information to give on these reasons why these attacks are very real to us, because there's a term that you're going to hear maybe more about in our near future called entropy. And in cryptography,
mhm.
entropy is another way, it's a loose way of saying randomness. Because when you think of math, right, 1 + 1 = 2, right, you think of these, math is very, you know, like on it. Like you do an algorithm, you're going to come up with a result. So having an algorithm that's going to produce a potentially different result, but on cue as expected, is a very complex algorithm to start with. But whenever you now have a system that can compute and try to defeat those possibilities of keys, that becomes very, risky, because the entropy is the true strength of the algorithm. How random those numbers can
Yes.
appear to any other system, whether it's a supercomputer or a quantum supercomputer or any grid type of computing. I know you mentioned, having repurposed blockchain systems, trying to also maybe with AI turn the attack. But I don't want to digress too much on this point. But just what people need to
Mhm.
keep in mind, there is a term when you start reading about encryption standards. You're going to read lots of papers. People are going to come out and say they have the best encryption algorithm.
Mhm.
This team has the best. This has the best solution. The key thing for any cyber professional to really pay attention to is the entropy. Listen to anybody out there in industry that's
Yes.
talking about entropy and how to address it with their solution.
Of course.
If entropy is
It
not in the
is key.
discussion, so to wrap up my statement, if entropy
I,
is not
I'm
part of
really
that
glad you
discussion,
mentioned it.
then don't have the
Yes.
discussion unless entropy is a part of the discussion. So
I'm really glad you mentioned it, and also that Tianhi's supercomputer. Why is that? Because this is, first of all, a very good transition to the next slide. But before I come to that, the very reason why China is pushing for lower than CNSA2 levels at the international level, because that way they still have a chance at cracking it using their existing, whether it's supercomputing or improvised graphic card arrays or whatever. Because let's face it, AI, the same thing, it's an excuse. The goal of what they are doing is not per se AI, it's much more military uses well, whether of AI itself or to be cracking cryptography again. So here, speaking of the entropy, actually, you can come here to the gist of the current disagreement that there is at the international level in terms of the standards for post-quantum cryptographic key exchange slash encapsulation, being it that for now, the path followed by the majority is, well, we have enough entropy in the old world, if you wish, pre-quantum, so we use that to seed the key of post-quantum mechanisms, and because it always worked, so we'll just continue like that and we'll be fine. But it's absurdity, and it has been demonstrated by the Ruhr Universität Bochum, which is a leading German university for hardware security verification. They were the ones to find out, for instance, that you can hide at the nano level a backdoor in a semiconductor. So at the atomic level, you can hide the backdoor, which puts under question the whole supply chain that we have nowadays for electronics, because it means you have to reshore everything, as you cannot trust anymore what's made outside of your controlled boundaries. When I say everything, it's everything, without exceptions. For now, there is, of course, an effort with the CHIPS Act to do that, but it's limited to the high-end stuff, which is fine. But it's not enough, because what goes in the missiles, it's much older chips at whatever number of nanometers, and to let this still be produced in large part by adversaries, that's probably not the best thing to do, especially in light that those adversaries often, more often than not, support even more aggressive adversaries that actually use those components to conduct kinetic attacks.
So, so you
Yes.
mentioned, supply chain. Supply chain risk management is not getting enough attention as it should. There's been some recent issues in supply chain, not just related to COVID and distribution, but related into the actual hardware and the embedded circuitry. And one of the things that right now the world is not paying enough attention to is Taiwan, because Taiwan is the number one microprocessor producer in the world, right?
Yes,
And
it
in the
is.
news, if you look at the geopolitical and the politics involved with China right now, they are threatening to potentially take back Taiwan. And if you
Mm-hmm.
understand one thing, the company there that makes the new AI chipsets, right? The new GPUs, if you will, like for NVIDIA, those patents,
Mm-hmm.
even though they're US patents, they're still manufactured in Taiwan. So let's
Yes.
talk this hypothetical. Let's say China takes Taiwan in the next
Mm-hmm.
months to years. They put at risk not only the global market for microprocessors, which would be a huge disruption to the supply chain.
Yeah.
This affects, and people, it's not about servers and your laptops and computers. It's your chipsets in your mobile devices. It's the chips that
Oh,
go in
of
your
course, in your
cars.
car,
It goes in your
everywhere. Yes.
car. It goes into your Wi-Fi routers. It goes into every electronic that's in your life. Which,
Yes.
if
Yes.
you really
Yes.
think about it, is so many devices, in your life, to include IoT devices, etc. But not just the microprocessors, but the threat to intelligence, to defense, to big dollar companies that need these advanced chipsets to be competitive in the market. So if China
Mm-hmm.
was to disrupt the global supply chain and take over Taiwan, that is why it's critical for countries like the US and other countries to look into alternative locations to build factories to manufacture chips in the EU and Africa. These countries need to be building the factories so that if this scenario should happen, they at least have some preparation now. You can't wait
Mm-hmm.
till then, the future, to happen to
Of
you.
course not.
You have to start today,
Mm-hmm.
working and planning today for what that future could be. So I just wanted to kind of throw that in there,
Yes.
Stefan, because I
No,
felt that's
I
important.
agree 100% with you. And as we mentioned, Taiwan, actually, we propose with what you see, for instance, here on the screen, means that they could actually break their chipset making hardware in the worst case scenario that the island gets overtaken and they don't want PR China to be able to use it. So with what we do, they could break it in such a way that from a data perspective, there would be no way that it could be recovered after the fact. in other words, and obviously that's not the way we sell it, but if someone were to make ransomware with what we do, that would be really bad. And now on to what I wanted to mention specifically here. What we did to enhance AES is to fix its weakest point, its Achilles heel, or backdoor, if you ask the Indian military, who, well, you never know exactly on which side they are. Uh, you will see that there is a weakness, and that, well, maybe 20 years ago it was okay. You could still use it despite that, etc. But now, with the advance of AI, of quantum computing, etc., it becomes unrealistic to keep on just using it and closing our eyes that there is this thing. No, we need to fix it. And the good news is that it's already done. We have fixed it. It is coded in a way that is automotive grade software. We even have now Rust part that has been completed, so meaning memory safe language as per the White House's latest recommendations, including, by the way, the other stuff, not only our enhanced AES, but also the post quantum signatures and hashing and etc. And this enables to increase the key, meaning yes, we do have a minimum that we believe is the right one and should be universal, by the way, of CNSA2, meaning AES 256. But what happens when you want to go beyond that? Because eventually you will have top secret data, for instance. So, for instance, for secret or top secret data, you will want to use larger keys. That's precisely also
Yeah.
what enhanced AES, EAS are, as it's trademarked in the US, enables. By default, we offer 512-bit encryption. We also support, of course, the 256, which is the basic level, and without any change to the hardware to run in an optimized fashion, it goes up to 1024 bits, so 4 times the current maximum, which already provides quite some security margin. But obviously, we also have software options that enable going further by using, for instance, larger block sizes. We saw that NIST recently started evaluating whether having larger block sizes would be something needed in the future. So the good news here as well, we have this ready since years already. Actually, that's something we had conveyed to Amazon already at the turn of 2019, 2020, as they were hosting the SC27 International Gathering about quantum safe cryptography. Well, they went relatively silent in the meantime, unlike my neighbors who are cutting their grass, so eventually I'll have to move. Uh, and just give me a second.
No worries.
So they went relatively silent in the meantime, but we saw very recently that AWS made surprise a proposal to NIST as to how could one make larger block size ciphers that are based on AES, but with a few modifications. So in essence, what we sent them at the turn of 2019, 2020, we did inform NIST. We don't have a reply yet, but let's say it's a very interesting topic and to be watched. As I mentioned, NIST, that's also how we got noticed in the first place of having some viable solution in that space, as we were a year before the one in Seattle, so hosted by AWS. We were at the same HCQSC event in Beijing, because in 2018 it was still normal to go to scientific conferences there, and you had NIST, you had all the large companies present, AWS as well, by the way. They were trying to sneakily catch a photo of our poster presentation, but I grabbed the guy for a selfie, so I still have the proof. And so there, NIST in public said, in the person of Dr. Lily Chen, who was heading their program at the time for that, that they would consider enhanced AES if the community, the cryptographic community, which is a very loosely defined term with a variable geometry, as we would say in French, my mother tongue, accepts it. So meanwhile, this is something that became a sector-specific standard, being it standardized for 5G in the ITUT, as a good practice, by extension for automotive, IPTV, still in the ITUT, and as well at the European level, as a way to store and that's a good use of blockchains in that case, store private data on a blockchain. Because one of the fundamental incompatibilities between European law and blockchains is that there is a provision, the Article 17 of the European General Protection, Data Protection Regulation, that says you have the right to be forgotten, or more prosaically, right of erasure. But the principle of a blockchain is that things never get erased. So how do you reconcile both? And it has been recognized in a German standard, technical standard, as well as a commentary of the law by very well respected German lawyers, that a way to respect that law while still being able to use a blockchain in Europe is to first of all use strong encryption, such as ours, and then only to put the data on the blockchain. That way, when you do that, and blockchain doesn't have to be blockchain, by the way, it could be any system that, for whatever reasons, does not allow you to delete the data after the fact. It could be a Chinese cloud provider, I improvised. And so still you would be able, by deleting the key, assuming you keep in possession and control of the key as the data owner, by deleting the key, because it's cryptography at a level that cannot be cracked even in the decades to come, you could obtain the functional equivalent to having deleted the data, and hence the law remains applied. For now, this is a very European thing, but we anticipate that with the various state level and probably soon federal level privacy laws in the US as well, or in Canada for that matter, that will evolve to become something that's transatlantic. So that's one of the things, as I was mentioning, the European institutes for standardization, concretely CENELEC, one of the focus areas to have standards that cater to those very, for now, specific needs of the European legislative order, but eventually that could very much find their place as the regulations also tend to go in the same direction in other democratic countries. Then on to the gist of the key encapsulation mechanisms matter that we touched upon in the very beginning. So far, including in CNSA2, there is the tentative choice finalist by NIST called Kyber. Well, it has been renamed, meanwhile, MLCAN, with some further elements inside, safety wheels, as I call them here, removed. So it's not exactly the same as the original Kyber. But for now, that's the current choice. And the tendency, very surprisingly, is to remove very precise guidance elements, so not only to remove some elements that could have eventually contributed to its safety, but also to remove very precise guideline as to how to implement it, which is very interesting, to put it mildly, in light of the fact that this is a cipher that precisely, if you don't implement it right, we happen to be one of the rare, if not the only company that does it in a way that within a specific context, using some specific type of hardware, we can reasonably consider that it's secure, at least against side channel attack. And, well, supposedly quantum, because it's in this category. It's not the one we recommend, but let's say it's feasible to implement it in a reasonably secure way. But for that to happen at large, and not only with one company. So here I'm not doing our marketing, I'm really trying to up the level of the standards and of the security in the cyber world. It would be highly beneficial that at the very least the standards go for a very detailed description of the security that should be in there, and the implementation details, so as to avoid some traps that then open the door to side channel attacks and whatnot, as has been shown numerous times in the past. Now, a very important aspect here, and which has been emphasized again in another publication regarding entropy that you highlighted before, but basically already in 2022, if I'm not mistaken, the IDF's cryptology unit called Madzov, they have published a paper which states if an adversary has enough RAM, enough random access memory, we are not speaking of quantum computers, so again, make the link with China, then they are able to crack it, period. Do we really believe today that our largest adversaries do not have sufficient RAM? I very strongly doubt it. And thus, our recommendation is to go for the most secure option that is currently being recommended, for instance, by the German BSI, which is called Classic Machiavellis, because that one does not have such issues. And on top of that, is much more easily defended against side channel attacks, meaning that if you add a few layers of hardware protection, you anyways have to do it with asymmetric post-quantum key encapsulation mechanisms, but it's doable. To the contrary of the category of ciphers where Kyber belongs, Kyber is not the only one, lattice-based ciphers are extremely difficult, and we speak from an implementer's point of view, so we really know what we are talking about, extremely difficult to, in general, defend against side channel attacks. There is only some specific category, class of hardware where we can say what, well, with the best that we know, and we got it verified, including in Ukraine, by the way, that it's resistant to side channel attacks. But you have to use exactly this hardware and exactly this implementation. So
And when
speaking
you
of something
mentioned
that,
proprietary, let's just use the proper word, proprietary hardware, because these devices, usually from a solution provider, is proprietary. Think of a type.
no, I did not mention proprietary hardware, but some very specific hardware, particular
Well,
hardware.
specific hardware,
But
but what's going to happen, and we can just go ahead and extend our vision in the
yeah, you
future.
extrapolate. Okay, I
This
understand. Yes,
this will
yes.
be a commercialized version of what Type 1 AP devices are for government, for defense,
Mhm.
right? So, for example, we're going to see companies that are going to put out different patents on their hardware that's going to be for their solution sets, and we're not seeing it advertised as such, but it only makes sense from a business perspective that you'll do what GDIT did, what Viasat did with their KG encryption devices. So it's just going to be an extension of that world into the commercial sectors, and we're not seeing it yet, but I believe that's what we're going to see, because at the end of the day, companies' number one goal is the bottom line, is to serve the stakeholders, increase the shares, make money. And with that being
Of
said,
course.
yes, will there be a kind of equivalent of an open source way, or a way that is vendor agnostic or vendor neutral? Yes. But I believe commercial entities will go towards the established, reputable, reputation-based companies to buy these type of services. But what I'd like to do,
It's very interesting what you mentioned, because to that end, I'm not making here a commercial presentation, but I will just very shortly respond to that bit. Unfortunately, in as much as the likes of IBM, for instance, are leading the quantum computing space, I very much believe when they say they will deliver a 4,000 qubit and more computer next year, yes, I have no problems at all believing them, because they did deliver so far on their timeline for quantum computers. But at the same time, in terms of providing solutions that enable to resist quantum computers, that's another story.
yeah.
And that's where you want to look into the real specialized companies, which happens to be the case of ours. Obviously, we are not the only one, but we have certain advantage in having already all of what is being considered here, both the good and the bad options, implemented in a way that is memory safe and basically done as safe as it gets. Where if you compare what currently, for instance, the Linux Foundation, which is IBM backed but not only, big names such as Sandbox AQ, the Google spin-off, etc., have joined them in trying to do something similar. So they call it the Post-Quantum Initiative, if I'm not mistaken. And their goal is precisely to do what we already have pre-developed, namely to have a robust, open source, in their case at least, cryptographic library for quantum resistant cryptography, meaning that whatever they are providing now, and typically it's liboqs, lib open quantum safe, that IBM, for instance, is advertising, is not market ready, is not robust. And even if you look at the very first header of that library or intro page or whatever, it's very clearly written, those are example implementations, don't use this in production ever, blah, blah, blah. So the notion of the established companies there is different to what it usually is, and that's very important to have in mind.
Yes.
And then there is another point which I believe I made before, but I'd like to stress on here. Limiting the high security to classified use only would be missing the mark because of how interconnected our societies are. I gave the example before of the general having a teenager in his or her home using TikTok. That's it. You can be as secure as you want on your DoD devices, but well, you have this small issue at home, and it's not going away. So there is that, and even we heard recently that Microsoft, and that was very surprising, I must say, even to me. I mean, I know they had security issues, but there was someone from DoD publicly stating that he made the support call to Microsoft outside, let's say, of the most usual business hours in the US, but it was a dedicated number for the DoD. And whom did he get on the other side of the line? The Chinese national for ensuring the support. So that goes very, very far. And again, answers a bit the usual suspects question. Maybe not in this case. And well, that's it for that part of the presentation. But I'm sure you have many more
Well,
questions.
you mentioned, about China and the RAM. Will our adversaries in other countries have? Of course, they're going to have access to lots of RAM. One of the things that I like to kind of let people know about is, I mentioned earlier
Yes.
about the top 500 list. I think your camera just went off, Stefan. Um,
No, no, I'll reactivate it. I'm just moving back to the
oh, no
previous
worries.
place because I
So
believe the neighbor is done cutting the grass.
Oh, no worries. So I'll put the link for the top 500 in the description below. But when you look at the top 500 supercomputers on the planet, you'll see the U.S. and
Yes.
China are the most prevalent on the top, let's say the top 50, top 100. But
Mhm.
when you look at those cities, for example, when you look at like China, for the average person, they're not going to, unless you're living in China and know Chinese geography and happen to know a lot of what the cities are, if you look at a lot of these cities, what I want people to kind of do, if you want to do some quick open source intelligence on that list, look at
Uh-huh.
what those
Yes.
cities were 10 years ago, 5 years ago, even three
Yep.
years ago, before that supercomputer made the list. Go back in time and see what did that city look like. I
Yep.
tell you, the majority of these supercomputers, they were put in locations that were super small farming villages that they built around the supercomputer. So to kind of put that in perspective, the amount of investment and the
Yes.
strategy of this country is to build a
Yes.
town where you build in the supercomputer, you build in the research laboratories, you build the
Mm-hmm.
apartments because your scientists and engineers and administrators have to live somewhere. You build the schools because they have families and kids that go to school there. You build these entire cities now around a supercomputer. So where the Tiani 2 sits, look at what that city looked like 5, 8, 10 years before the Tiani 2 was developed and became officially operative. These cities didn't exist. So when you look at that 500 list, you start seeing all these cities. Now, some of them are nearby a major city. Like if you look like Guangzhou or Ganzhou, that city is very established. But where that supercomputer facility is far outside of the city. But when you look
I
at a lot of these,
100% agree.
yeah, so when you look at a lot of these cities that have, exploded due to having that supercomputer there, that whole city has been purposely built so that whenever that supercomputer needs to go to what's called maximum capacity for processing, meaning they want to do something like make an operation, defeat an encryption session, etc., they are able to shut down the whole city and direct all power all cooling systems and everything into that supercomputer, because that's what those cities are built for. And the U.S. is not doing that. If you look at our supercomputers on that list, it's IBM. It's different entities and commercial entities that are put together for their R&D purposes, or they're funded by nonprofit organizations, educational institutions. We do have some great, powerful supercomputers, but we don't have that supercomputer in the middle of Boston built to where we could divert all power to it. We don't have a supercomputer in the middle of New Mexico that is built and that town exists because of that. We're not having this kind of level of strategy. So when you start looking at the government, how they're building this strategy, this is what I want people to think about. Imagine having 100 plus supercomputers in the whole entire nation. Then you are the first or among the first 2 or 3 people to have a quantum supercomputer. Now you have AI, you have a quantum supercomputer, and you have an army of regular supercomputers that are ready to take down and work in conjunction and orchestrated by AI to now run these attacks at a level that we have not fathomed yet. And when
100%. But on a more human level, if you allow me.
Yeah. So when Stiepan is talking about the industry and how people are saying, let's just do the minimum, or hey, this has worked for us in the past, it's going to be good enough for the future. This is where they're not thinking about. They're not thinking about this scenario I just mentioned to you. A quantum supercomputer with a powerful AI platform orchestrating attacks with the help of 100 plus supercomputers that will overwhelm. And even if best case scenario, our AI protection security systems are able to detect it and stop trying to work towards stopping it, at best, we're going to be seeing unprecedented denial of service attacks. Unprecedented. Okay? That are going to be going after, multiple layers in our defense in depth strategies. It's going to go after supply chain issues. It's going to overwhelm, even if it can overwhelm one integrated circuit on a board somewhere in your system and make that meltdown and cause a chain reaction. We're going to see a lot of these very sophisticated, specialized attacks that we can't fathom yet. And the reason why when Stiepan talks about quantum resistant, and the other word I'm going to tell you to pay attention to is quantum proof, because in science, you must experiment it. The community must have at least 2 respected individuals in the community, usually competitors. One will say, I have proven that this algorithm is quantum proof. Then he'll publish his paper, and then someone else in the scientific community, usually someone that doesn't want him to be right, is going to test it too and say, you know what? He's actually right. So until we have 2 esteemed mathematicians say this algorithm is quantum proof, then it is not, it only can be deemed quantum resistant, because quantum resistant is another way of saying, given the information we have today, this is our most probable and most likely guess. So that's resistant. Proof means it's been verified by science and by experiments by at least 2 mathematicians. We're not there yet.
I'm not sure it's the exact scientific definition, but I definitely follow where you're getting at. And if I can take just a step back to the human element here, because in as much as China can indeed, as you said, build a supercomputer and a whole city around it because they decided that that's the way they wanted to go. Similarly, they may not be able to do that forever. That's another question. But similarly, where they really put the emphasis, as we mentioned before, they actually generally do things. And so it would not be far-fetched to imagine that they could buy the whole group of editors that is dealing with the current international standard, except maybe for me. It's just a hypothesis, I did not accuse anyone. But it's a realistic possibility, and when you cannot buy someone, you can maybe coerce him or her, because him or her would have family in China and whatnot. So those are all things that are very unfortunately, but also very materially in the realm of possibility and pretty high likelihood given the stakes.
So what Stiepan just said there is so true. Remember the World Cup scandal when the World Cup came to Qatar and people were like, how did this Middle Eastern desert hot country get the World Cup?
Sponsors of terrorism on top of it.
Yes, and they had all this scandal and these investigations and people that were trying to track the money. And imagine if there's that level of corruption and scandal within the World Cup. When we're talking about data supremacy, we're talking about having an advantage not only in commercial markets, financial markets,
Mm-hmm.
defense and intelligence markets. If that the prize is data supremacy, as I'll call it,
Mm-hmm.
then all bets are off the table. Everybody's going to be doing everything they can, to include bribing
Exactly.
people, influencing, like you said, the legislation to lower the standards so that they can
Yes.
compromise them. This is very important. So
100%.
so we could talk the technology, the algorithms, and the definitions, but at the end of the day, it's going to come down to people. People like Stiepan, people that are in this industry that are influencing, reviewing the laws, reviewing the standards. The human element will never leave cybersecurity, and it's become more and more important that more professionals like Stiepan are needed in this discussion, are needed in the right rooms, influencing our lawmakers and the decision makers. But with that being said, Stiepan, I kind of want to take a pause on discussing any more quantum right now, because I know we're running over an hour, and there's some questions I want to talk about that are not
Mm-hmm.
directly quantum related. And I want to kind of,
Sure.
anyone watching the podcast at this point, Stiepan has given a wealth of knowledge, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure I have his socials in the description below, so that you can connect with Stiepan. You can read any papers him or his company has published. He has a wealth of information that he still has yet to give. That he's only giving you 1%, like
There's
1% of
been
that.
just one new paper, by the way, shout out, in the SC27 Journal
Yes.
by me, regarding essentially the same subject as you saw in this presentation, but with a bit more detail scientifically. But it's a very short piece, one and a half page, about how should we do, how should we proceed to have the best possible cryptography standards. So if you look up the SC27 Journal, you will find it. It's in the latest
So
edition.
if you can give me that link, I will put that in
I
the
will,
description.
yeah,
So
sure.
Stiepan, let's kind of change up some of the questions, because I do want to wrap us up, but I want to get some good questions in. I want people that are watching this point, they're like, wow, this Stiepan guy, he's level 99, he's plugged into the industry, he's connected with the mathematicians, the right groups, organizations, he's plugged in. But if I'm watching this as like I'm at home and someone's saying, hey, how do I start my cybersecurity journey if I want to go into cryptography, if I want to become like Stiepan one day? How do I start at level 1? So Stiepan, what are some websites, some resources, books you recommend, mentors,
Mhm.
influencers? Who would you recommend people start following on social and reading? Where can they start at level 1, getting more knowledgeable about cryptography and maybe pursuing a career
Mhm.
in cryptography?
So how I started, but that was a while back, when I was a teenager, was reading the Handbook of Applied Cryptography by Bruce Schneier. This is
Bruce
old,
is a
but
rock star in cryptography.
yes, it does provide a very good introduction to the subject, and so I still consider it as a good reference, even though it's dated. Now, for more recent stuff, I would say any, um, especially proceedings of post-quantum conferences up until and including 2017 are very good to be read. Why 2017? Because in 2018, the new law on national security of the People's Republic of China entered into force, which says any Chinese company or citizen has to collaborate with the MSS,
Hmm.
so the secret services of China. What does that mean? Since then, science has been corrupted by China very actively. So it's not only in this field. Everything post 2017, you have to not double check, but quadruple check. So
Yes.
that's just to give, how to say, general indication. But up until 2017, whether it's what NIST has published or those proceedings, etc., very, very instructive materials. After that, it's more of a dark epoch we have entered into, with only some rare papers going for the truth, and the rest being more of a mixture of geopolitical and commercial battles.
Hmm. So Stefan, I'm gonna now do what I call my rapid fire questions. This is all for fun. So we like to have a moment in the podcast where there's no right or wrong answer. These are just strictly for fun, to give a little bit of levity to the podcast, because we talked a lot of
Mhm.
serious topics here. So let's have a little
Yes,
fun.
yes,
So,
let's laugh a little bit.
all right, here we go. Star Wars or Star Trek?
Yes, I remember that one. when we tried this using Teams.
Yes.
So, which one was which one? I believe Star Wars means Kyber, right? And
Yes.
Star Trek means another one.
Yes.
Uh, well, I would say another one.
Got you. Got you. Star Trek. What is a hot dog? A sandwich?
Is a hot dog a sandwich? Well, uh, yeah, sort of. It's a special way of doing a sandwich, but yes.
Okay, so hot dog sandwich. Okay, cake or pie?
What is the allusion here?
Well, do you prefer as a dessert cake or pie? Cake is,
Yeah, yeah, okay. There is no allusion. I was trying to find something like Star Wars and that, but no. Here, as one would say in French, I give my tongue to the cat. Je donne ma langue au chat. I don't know what's the right answer, but
okay.
if you really ask my personal preference, uh, if it starts with some pie, sorry, with some
Fruit.
good fruit, I guess that's really nice. But well, you can have also excellent cake, so it depends.
Okay. Well, so Stefan, is there any other projects that you're working on, whether a personal project that you could share with us, or what is a thing within your business? Is there something you want to highlight now at this part of the conversation to say, hey, I'm currently working on this, and if you want to follow me on social to keep track of that, what is that thing that people can be watching coming from you in the next weeks to months to years?
Yes. So one very important thing is our collaboration with MIS, Mnemonic Identity Solutions. They're a UK company which spun off out of a Japanese company and being providers of the Japanese SDF, so self-defense forces, since more than 10 years. They now fully integrate our technology, and it's with them, by the way, that we worked on the Rust version of our technology. So expect much more from that end for sure. And besides that, to have continuous updates on whether it's external publications, reviews, or whatnot regarding our technologies. I mentioned in the earlier stage of our conversation, Ruhr Universität Bochum as the ones having found how the supply chain is in tatters for the electronics. But actually, they were also the ones who have, at the greatest level of detail so far, validated that the enhanced AES that we are providing alongside with its authenticated mode of operation called HBA is done in a secure way, to make it very simple. And that's something to watch as well, because there is an ongoing process to actually make this, namely the authenticated encryption that goes along with our innovation, a standard in ISO. So that's a space to be followed alongside with all the other developments, and looking forward to action more.
Okay. Last two questions, and then we can let you go because I know your time is valuable, Stefan. But who is someone that in your career or currently, who is someone that you look up to? Who is a mentor or influencer for you? Because I know you're at level 99, but is there someone in industry that you look up to or that earlier in your career you really admired and is the reason why you do what you do?
Oh, uh, I'm not sure it would be a person. But let's say, speaking of the current stage of my business developments, and my development as a cybersecurity professional, I would say that our current group chairman, who first of all was not at all our group chairman, he first of all was external, then became an advisor, and eventually became our group chairman, Professor Pavuna, is really a reference in terms of the scientific knowledge, quantum physics, etc. So it's always very, very interesting to listen to the latest he has to say, especially as it relates to now what we call biophysics, so the use of advanced physics to have a hopefully positive influence, at least in the case of what he's working on our biology, in the sense of longer, healthier lives, etc. So I find those things quite inspiring.
Wonderful. And my last question, anyone that's still watching the podcast at this point that is, they're like, I don't think I can do this. I don't think I could do crypto. I don't think I could do cyber. What would you speak to that person that's just not sure that they can get into this field and grow with it?
Well, you don't have to necessarily innovate in cryptography, being that, let's say, now the standards are about to be established or in process of being established for this latest generation of cryptography. That's then expected to last for decades, as the last one lasted for decades. However, there is a huge need in persons that will help the deployment of this. And you can really choose this, how to say, with a closed eyes as a career path. Because there is the Quantum Computing Cybersecurity Preparedness Act in the US since December 2022, which is mandating at the whole US federal level every agency, whether national security or not, related, to migrate to quantum resistant cryptography. That's huge. And they have a deadline until 2035 to do the migration. I'm almost certain the deadline will be postponed, as those things usually go. So that's bad on one hand, but on the other hand, and sorry, if you are looking for career advice, become a field engineer in that area to help the deployment, etc. That's really somewhere where there will be lots and lots of work.
Thank you. Well, Stefan, it's been a tremendous honor. You have provided, I would say, a treasure trove of post quantum resistant information on cryptography. You've provided, the presentation slides alone that you've shared has just been tremendous amount of information. So thank you so much for your time. And for those that don't know, this is the second time me and Stefan had to do it because we did have some technical issues with using Teams before. But we now have this
Yes.
has been done. We've successfully made it to the end of
We are
this
using
recording.
our own platform this time,
Yeah.
so fingers crossed it should be good.
Yes. So again, Stefan, thank you so much, and please send me your link to your paper that you just released.
I
I will
will.
include it in the description. I'll
I
also
will,
include
and
his.
also provide you the link to the latest RUB paper I was
Yes,
referring to about the entropy, because I noticed it is of your interest, and I
it
believe it
is
should be of the
very much
public
of
as
my
well.
interest. So again,
Yeah.
Stefan, thank you, and that has been the Top Cyber Pro podcast.